Our next speaker is an activist from here in London who's even chaired London chapter meetings and spoken about a natural law resource-based economy at Speaker's Corner. He's here to give a talk entitled Cave Floor Sketches, Critiquing and Transforming London's Communities, which should be very insightful. Please welcome to the stage Kyle Farren.
Is it okay if I move this? Can you hear me? Like this? Yeah? Okay. So I'm not going to use any PowerPoint, so I apologize for those people who do like to see pictures and diagrams. I'm just going to do it the old-fashioned way. Can I just say about that speech you just gave, I started to feel unclenching in my heart. You know, sorry if this is getting a bit too cheesy, but I carry a lot of stress with me. I work in a cafe. I'm like kind of a barista, but I also make pizzas. I do some activism on the side. And everywhere I go, I carry expectations. That there's a perfect amount of hours I can put in doing public speaking at Speaker's Corner, which is my preferred method of activism. That there's a perfect number of audience members to have in an audience. And it's funny, before we started this event, I was chatting with Adam outside, having some water, and I mentioned this idea of not having any expectations, and he said, that's what I'm going to speak about. And in my mind I thought, I expect it's going to be very good. And then I caught myself. Luckily I've heard about mindfulness before, and I started to catch myself in that act of projecting what I thought was going to happen. It's kind of a paradox that when you're practicing something and getting more disciplined at it, you can't be aware that you're getting good. So I play guitar sometimes as well, and if I'm aware that I'm doing quite well at this chord, or doing quite badly, then it's going to take me out of it. Now I'm going to get on to the main part of my speech. So actually today what I wanted to talk about was cave floor sketches, or cage floor sketches. That image of a cage I took from an article by Noam Chomsky called Expanding the Floor of the Cage. It was actually an interview. And in it he uses the image of a cage to signify the state. The state, as many of us feel and think, is an oppressive institution in many ways. But at the same time, it uses that oppression to secure some aspect of a vision of freedom. So for example, the NHS we had mentioned in another speech. The state, fundamentally an institution built on coercion, has a monopoly on violence, imposes taxes, drafts laws. It can be used to also create NHSs. Now this idea of expanding the floor of the cage, if we recognize that we're in this cage, we can start to think, maybe how can we expand it? I personally think, I'm a friend of the Zeitgeist Movement, and I'm very thankful that they're allowing me to speak today, because I've never actually spoken to an audience like this before. But I have to say, something I've carried with me during my time with the Zeitgeist Movement is that they tend to have a vision of what life is going to be like once we get out of the cage. And personally, I would dedicate most of my energy, maybe 80% of my energy, to trying to expand the floor of the cage. How can we, in the moment now, work within the institutions we have to secure some kind of change? And maybe carry that vision inside us of a natural law, resource-based economy, an economy that's in line with nature. Carry that inside us, let that animate our activism, but not let it take over to the point where we are just sitting and thinking wishfully. So I'm going to just spend about 5 minutes chatting about some of the problems in London's communities. I know it sounds very presumptuous of me, I'm only 21 years old, offering critique and transformation and ideas for transformation. It may sound very presumptuous, but I'm a student, I have a lot of time on my hands, and I think I have some responsibility with this time. You know, I don't have to put food on the table. I can take time to reflect on these ideas and maybe share them with you, so I do see it as a responsibility. I'll spend about 5 minutes chatting about that, London's communities, some of their problems, mainly talking about the media. We're talking about banks as well, and I'll be talking about the state. And in particular, I'll be talking about the role of propaganda, the role of terrorism, and the role of debt in securing this framework we find ourselves in, this cage, if you will. After I've spoken about that, I will move on to talking about the need for a new social movement. My first argument will be that there is a London establishment. There is an establishment in London based on these three, so the media, banks, and the state. And we need to find out ways to challenge it. That'll be my first argument. In the second part, my second argument will be we need a new social movement. And in particular, we need a movement for precarious workers. So people like myself, and like my mother. She teaches English as a foreign language, quite low-paid job, very insecure. I'll be talking about ways for that group of people to overcome their insecurity. So, let me begin by saying that I think propaganda is probably the most important issue. I don't think it's just another issue like climate change, or Black Lives Matter, or feminism, anti-racism, all of these ideologies. I think the propaganda and the role of the mass media is probably the most important issue. It's from there that we start to ask questions about politics, start to ask questions about stress and the role of disease. If we can create a media that's transparent, we can start to engage in debates about democracy that empower us, not just keep us as passive spectators. Jeremy Corbyn might win. Oh, Theresa May might win. And then what then? We just go back to our lives, right, after having had that vote. Is that all we are as citizens? No, I would prefer to see a civic journalism, a journalism that empowers individuals, so it doesn't just confine them to the margins. Probably the most important speaker to ever write about this topic is Noam Chomsky, I would say, in the last century. He's probably the most important speaker on propaganda. Many of you have probably heard of his book, Manufacturing Consent. And in it, he goes into a detailed explanation of why the media works the way it does. He starts by exploring the role of advertising. He asks the question, what kind of vision of the world do you expect from a newspaper like The Guardian when most of its advertising revenue, when it gets most of its revenue from advertising, and that advertising is fossil fueled? What kind of vision of the world do you expect to see? Not only that, we ask the question about ownership. When a newspaper is owned by a person like Rupert Murdoch, what kind of vision of the world do you expect to see? Somebody who's dedicated to a sort of blend of republicanism and Thatcherism. What kind of vision do you expect? So it's ownership and advertising. He also talks about three others, which I won't go into detail because of a lack of time. But I do encourage you to read that book, Manufacturing Consent. Now, this has implications for the United Kingdom, and specifically London, because London is a big centre for these newspapers and magazines, and we have the BBC, which is centred here, Auntie Beebs. If we start to, I think, look at that question of propaganda, how it's affecting our lives, confining us in this cage, we could start to ask questions about politics. We can actually, we can get back to that root of what politics is. It's now a dirty word, isn't it, politics? People say, I don't want to talk about politics, I'm not interested in politics. It's a dirty word, because actually what they mean is statecraft. They mean the operations of the state. They mean the operations of experienced statesmen and women. That's what they're referring to. I can't stand watching David Cameron give his really heartfelt speeches to the camera. To a camera, not to you, face to face, but, it's about as undemocratic as it gets. A real democracy, a real politics would deal with the life of the city, the polis. It would bring us into a face-to-face direct communication. That's what I hope to do at Speaker's Corner, which I'll talk about at the end, and I'll touch on democracy again. So I've talked about the media. I'm going to talk now about the state. So I would say that the United Kingdom is a major source of terrorism. I know that for a lot of people, when they hear that, they think, okay, how can that possibly be? We have politicians dedicated to peace and human rights and so on. I think that what you have, and Noam Chomsky's drawn attention to this, on the surface you have what the politicians say they're going to do for the cameras, and then what they actually do. The reality is that we help to prop up regimes like the Saudi regime and the other Gulf states. We continue to be a major arms exporter. We continue to retain nuclear weapons. All of these things move us in the direction of greater terrorism, or at least a greater risk of it happening to us. If we have lots of nuclear weapons, we're going to be more likely to be a target for a nuclear attack from another nuclear state, say like North Korea, as was mentioned in another speech. If we continue to prop up regimes like the House of Saud, we're going to see more terrorism in the form of Islamist radicals, young men typically, who have a kind of a hero complex, rising up, getting together, want some meaning in their life, doing vicious acts on the streets. We're going to see more of that because we're part of the problem, is what I'm trying to say here. We are within the system and we're helping to keep it going by not recognizing the role of our state in keeping terrorism a major threat. So I would have gone into more detail on that, but I do encourage you to look at the work of Mark Curtis, who's amassed a very important record of British foreign policy since the end of World War II. He's gone into detail about how Britain put down rebellions in Kenya, the Mau Mau massacre. He's looked at Britain's role in massacres in East Timor, by the Indonesian government, and a host of others. I'd say Mark Curtis is probably the leading figure in studying Britain's role in terrorism. So, onward to the third part of my first section. I'll be talking now about banks. So I'm not an expert in banking. I study history and anthropology. I don't study economics. But I am a big fan of the work of Andrew Dyson, who's, I believe, has actually given a speech at ZDay in the past. This other awareness, so we have the first awareness that maybe the media is not what we think it is. It's not this transparent medium. We have the second awareness that maybe our government isn't got our best interests at heart. And we got our third awareness, which I'd like to say now, is this idea that banks don't work how we think they work. Some people think banks work like a piggy bank. You put money in it and then you take it out for a rainy day. That's not how it works. Some people think, oh, so you put money in and then that money can later be used for people borrowing. So the more investments there are in an economy, the more savings we have in an economy, the more investments we can have. That's another image of how banking works, and that's wrong as well, according to Andrew Dyson. Actually, how banking works is that banks create money. Every time you take money out of your bank account, you're creating money out of nothing. It's the numbers you see on your screen, they're actually liabilities. That's not the money that's in your account. That's what the bank says they're going to pay you. So I don't want to get too technical on this, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but that's another thing I need to keep in mind. This is another way that banks secure their power over the British public, and in particular, people living in London. Londoners like myself. Banks, in combination with the media and the state, I would say these three elements really define the London establishment. You've got Fleet Street, you've got the mass media, you've got Whitehall, with its support for terrorist states like Saudi Arabia, and you've got, on the third count, the city, the square mile. So those three entities together, I would say, are the key sort of elements of the London establishment. Now, I'm going to spend the last, do I have 5 minutes? I don't want to go over time, so... Yeah? Okay. I'll spend the last 5 minutes. Usually in my speeches I tend to spend about 70% talking about the problem and then 30% talking about possible solutions, because, to be honest, I don't think I know that many solutions to a lot of these things. Kind of depressing, I know, but... the solution, I would say, the most important solution, I would say, for the here and now, sort of goals as opposed to visions. I think the speakers before me have offered visions. But these can be maybe complemented by goals. You can have your head in the clouds and your feet on the ground at the same time. There's no contradiction there. As for goals, I'd say, fostering a social movement for precarious workers. I don't know if any of you here today consider themselves precarious workers. By precarious, I mean, someone there, a few people, Precarious, what I mean by that is like living on a knife's edge kind of thing. One paycheck away from eviction is quite a common, thing you hear. They're often victims of loan sharks, or, payday loan, attacks. They've often had their education commodified to the point where now I'm paying quite a lot of money for my degree. They having the first time in history, according to Guy Standing, who coined that term, the precariat, which actually was introduced in the first speech. David mentioned it, precariat. According to Guy Standing, precariat are the first social class whose education is actually above the level of labour they're expected to perform. So what that means is you have people with degrees, sometimes even in mathematics and science, pulling pints. Doing precarious jobs, flexible hours, that kind of thing. You have people with PhDs sometimes working in Asda and Walmart. It's an interesting state of affairs. It's never happened throughout history. Never. I think in the past, my parents' generation, you could have a degree, and if you were competent, you'd get a job. You're guaranteed a career. I don't think that's the case anymore. I don't think that's the reality we're living in now. So what are the three aspects of a precarious worker movement that I think are the most important? Like a social movement to sort of alleviate this chronic sense of uncertainty and anxiety that plague us. What are the three aspects? I'd say the first one is a charter of demands. That sounds very militant, but you could translate it in a more sensitive way to a list of things that people need. So a charter of demands. I'll go into detail on what those might include. Secondly, we'll have a repertoire of contention, or in other words, just a toolbox for resistance. A list of possible tools that we can actually use to make sure that we get those things that we need. And then finally, a rendezvous. So a place to actually meet. So in London, I'd use Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. That is my favourite meeting point for meeting activists. And I hope maybe I'll see many of you there. I'm a regular speaker. I go out every Sunday. I get up on my soapbox and presume to tell people how they should live their lives. I'd love to see all that. So those are those three. So a charter, a repertoire, and a rendezvous. The first, so the Charter of Demands. So Guy Standing has written a book called The Precarious Charter, in which he starts to go through this, like list of things that we need. He talks about the need for a commons, a revived commons. And what does that mean? A commons is sort of it's basically referring to parks, public spaces, quality open space. It could be like organic nature in the form of parks, or it could be the digital commons. We have a whole variety of things that we get in the commons. So we have things like the NHS. That's open to everybody. Doesn't matter how much money you have, you get it. That's a good idea of the commons. The language we're speaking right now, that's part of the commons. That can't be privatized. As much as many academic journals try to, sort of trademark their terms that they use, we can't actually do that. It's just language is too fluid. So we have the commons there. There's a whole, Robin Hood actually, I think he epitomizes that in a symbolic way. Robin Hood, he was a person who lived in the commons, lived and breathed it. Now, he's very much in the British consciousness, Robin Hood, along with King Arthur, who's kind of the flip side. If we sort of take on a Robin Hood mentality, but maybe apply non-violent means, we could come to quite an interesting sort of form of rebellion. Then I'd say, so that's the charter. I'd say also, in addition to the commons, I'll talk about basic income very briefly. A basic income is another proposal that many people have heard about in the Zeitgeist Movement, but I'll just quickly explain it for people who aren't so sure. A basic income is a monthly payment to every citizen in society, and it's paid regardless of whether you work or not. And it's designed to take away the stigma of receiving benefits. It would be a replacement to benefits, in fact. You'd get it whether you're rich or poor, or a child or an adult. You get this basic income. So, universal basic income and strengthening the commons. I'd also say decommodifying education, making education free again, regulating those payday loans companies I was mentioning earlier. There are a whole host of, there's about 23, I believe, articles in Guy Standing's Charter of Demands, and they all deserve very careful attention. I'll quickly talk about the sort of repertoire of contention that we'd be using. Now, I've amassed about a dozen of these. Sadly, I don't have any pamphlets with me to hand out, but I could just quickly list their names, and I believe this is going to be recorded, so perhaps we could, anybody who's interested can go and find it online, can pause it and go into more detail. I'll just quickly race through them. So we have, in this toolbox of resistance, these sort of dozen tools of contention, I would place right at the top, non-violent communication. So communication is compassionate and based on needs, as opposed to moral, this is bad, this is good, needs. So that's non-violent communication. Second one I would say is what's called critical pedagogy. That's just a fancy way of saying teaching that empowers the student, that doesn't empower the teacher. Third, I would invite you all to look at consensus decision making. And this comes in two flavors. So formal consensus, which is a little bit more rigid, and consensus-oriented decision, which is a bit more informal. Both of those are useful for different situations. So after that, we have non-violent action. And that, I think, is the most important one. If I was to ask you to take anything away from this speech, this very brief speech of mine, I would say that non-violent action carries the key to successful social change. It's based on this awareness that if you don't add fuel to the fire anymore, the fire goes out. That's the basic idea of nonviolent action. And Gene Sharp is the key thinker in this respect. His entire life's work, he's another very old sort of hardcore activist. He's given a lot of his life to studying Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez and so on. Gene Sharp, so he's an interesting person to look at. So we have nonviolent action. I'll talk about the MAP, which is the Movement Action Plan. That's from Bill Moyer. It's a way of organizing whole social movements. At the smaller level, you've got Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. So how to organize at the root level at your community. So just literally looking outside your door. You know, like knocking on doors and asking people to come around and meet, talk about problems such as pollution, whatever it could be. I mean, talking about London's ecological problems, where I think one of the most polluted cities in Europe, if not the most polluted, I believe. That could be an interesting project for a local community to organize around, dealing with that. So we've got community organizing, the MAP, nonviolent action, nonviolent communication, consensus decision making. I'd also touch on the other ones, but I believe we're sort of running out of time a little bit, so I'll just very briefly say, yeah, I'm a regular speaker at Speaker's Corner, so anybody who wants to sort of hear more about these ideas, want to help me sort of get a new social movement off the ground, a new precarious worker movement. And you don't have to be a precarious worker, this is open for everybody. I'd encourage you to meet me on a Sunday. I'm usually there in the afternoons, not every week, but pretty much every week. And yeah, if you have any more questions, please feel free at the end. I think we're going to do a Q&A, right? Okay. Thank you very much for having me here. Cheers.
And keep the applause going, come on. Thank you.